Good evening and welcome everyone to tonight's public forum, which is brought to you as part of the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas series. Today we're meeting on and broadcasting from Lutruwita, Tasmania, which is Aboriginal sea, land and waterways. And as a reflection of our institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, the Palawa people. The Palawa people are the original and traditional custodians of the land from which we're broadcasting today. And originally named Pataway in Palawakani, we stand on the shores now as they once did. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and those who did not make elder status. We acknowledge the deep history of storytelling, knowledge sharing, and caring for the land. We stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language, and history, and the continued fight for Aboriginal justice and rights, paving the way for a strong future. My name is Daryl Stelmack, and I'm a lecturer here at the Cradle Coast campus of the university, a lecturer in emergency management. And prior to joining the university, I spent 20 years in the field of humanitarian assistance, working in situations of war and disaster. So I've been a first-hand witness to some of the issues that we'll be discussing tonight. So for me, this panel is both professional and personal. I'm a lecturer here at the Cradle Coast campus of the university. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please, those of you who are here today in person, we're broadcasting live across the world. So for those of you who are here in the room with us, please, could you mute your devices or turn them off entirely to avoid any interruptions? In the event of emergency, our staff here at the event will show you to the exit. Simply go down the stairs and out the nearest exit. The bathrooms are just right here around the corner, out and to your left. For those of you who are online, please note that your camera, microphone, and hands up function are shut off for your privacy, but also to facilitate management of the questions. We do encourage you to ask questions online. There's a Q&A chat button at the bottom of your screen. You can click that and enter your questions, and the staff here will deal with it and forward it to me. You can type your questions anonymously if you wish. We're going to address as many questions as we can from both the audience online and in real space in the Q&A session later tonight. And finally, this lecture is being recorded and it'll be available later on YouTube and SoundCloud. We'll supply you the details at the end of the event. So once again, on behalf of the university, I'd like to express sincere gratitude for your being here and to welcome you all, whether you're joining us personally or from your living room. It's a great delight to share this with you. The Island of Ideas series began in 2020 as a way of, during the pandemic, reconnecting the community and the ideas that are coming out of the university when we were unable to host the face-to-face events that we normally would. So we're continuing the online program now in 2022, and it's evolving as we go. So we hope to continue with this mission of connecting people around Tasmanian to the university and to the research that's coming out of our institution. Every year we're presenting hundreds of lectures and workshops, and this goes on alongside the regular teaching of students and interactions with alumni and so on. All of these conversations are very important to the university because they're at the core of our role, at the core of producing public good for Tasmania and for people of Tasmania. And so connection, collegiality, and community are really at the heart of what we do, and they date back to our founding values. So that's very much what brings us here today, the idea of connection. And it's in that spirit of connection and collaboration that I'm bringing together three remarkable colleagues with very different disciplines to have a discussion about truly awful topics, but exceedingly important topics. So obviously we're going to be dealing with some very confronting issues tonight. You know that, you wouldn't be here without knowing that, but it's worth bearing in mind. It's also worth bearing in mind, I think, the history of this place, of this island that we're broadcasting from, because many generations ago, some things happened here that today would probably be considered atrocities. We'll be focusing on a different set of events happening now, but very far away. So some events are close in space, but far in time. Some are far in space, but close in time. No matter where they happen and when they happen, they affect us all. And the ripples of those events go down through generations and across space and time to affect us all. That's why it's important for us to confront them as individuals, but also as a society. And that's what we're doing by gathering here tonight. So I have these excellent colleagues to present to you now for this evening's forum of investigating war crimes in the age of social media. Please join me in welcoming my colleagues, Professor Alana Mann, head of the Media School at the University of Tasmania, Dr. Matt Killingsworth, head of politics and international relations, and also of the Red Cross International Committee on Humanitarian Law for Tasmania, and Tim McCormack, who is a native of Burnie and professor of international law at the University of Tasmania, special advisor on war crimes to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Welcome, all three of you. Ukraine is almost certainly going to dominate much of our discussion tonight. So there's a good reason for that. We're currently witnessing what is the largest war in Europe since World War II, and the largest displacement and refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. The Ukraine is an agricultural and industrial powerhouse, and it's been foundational to the Soviet economy since, well, for the entire existence of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before that. That's why it matters to Russia. Ukraine has deep social and political ties and cultural ties to Russia, but it often finds itself in conflict with Moscow because the drive for independence in Ukraine is very strong. It was one of the factors that led to the genocidal famine in the 1930s, the Holodomor that was perpetrated by Stalin, and that drive to independence is clearly visible today. The roots of the current conflict trace to 2014, when Ukrainians ousted a pro-Moscow government and instilled a more separatist government, or a government that was more dedicated to their sovereignty. This angered Moscow, who responded, as we remember from the news, by seizing Crimea and fueling a separatist insurgency in the eastern states. In turn, Ukraine turned to the West and to NATO, and this further angered Moscow to the point that the current invasion began about mid-February. So in the face of stiff resistance, Russia has had to perhaps realign their aims. They are no longer aiming to take the capital of Kyiv, but they're focusing instead on southern and eastern regions and trying to capture those border regions. Vladimir Putin has really insisted quite strongly that this is a police action or a security action, and the aim is to denazify Ukraine and to make it a neutral place. And that question of denazification, I think, is where the propaganda war begins, and it's where we can begin our discussion. So I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Alana Mann. Prior to joining the university, Professor Alana Mann led the Department of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney. She was food lead researcher at the Sydney Environment Institute. She embarked on doctoral research on food sovereignty campaigns in Latin America and Europe after a career, starting in 2007, after a career in media and marketing, which included 7 years at Fairfax Media, the publisher of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Alana's worked with Food First Information and the Action Network in Heidelberg, Germany. She's conducted fieldwork at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, and she served on the committee to appoint the Australasian representative to civil society mechanism of the UN Committee for World Food Security in 2017. She was part of the Post-Truth project at the University of Sydney. So please welcome our first speaker, Professor Alana Mann.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you for being with us tonight. I would like to offer my acknowledgement and respect for the traditional owners of the land, especially for anyone in the audience. And I would like to start by saying I'm not going to criticise social media because I think social media gets blamed for a lot of things. And the things that I see happening in the conflict in the Ukraine are things that have been happening in the legacy media, if you like, over decades. So those of us old enough to have read newspapers will know that fake news is nothing new, for example. However, there's no doubt that the technologies that we see operating today across multiple platforms are definitely amplifying the messages that get shared through that legacy media. And that's really important to remember. There's something else that I think we should remember, which is fake news does not actually crowd out hard news, legitimate news. So I think it's very important for us to give ourselves credit as well and recognise that audiences are quite discerning when it comes to their information consumption. What this means is that we need to think about how news is being used strategically. We know that Putin, for a long time, has been using news very strategically. We know Pravda is a state organ of the media. And we know that he's been using social media very effectively as a foreign policy tool as well. In 2014, Angela Merkel said to Barack Obama, we need to be careful of Putin because he lives in his own world. And I would argue that he has created that alternative reality through the media in Russia. So the point I really want to make is we need to look at the Western media and how it is presenting the conflict. And we need to consider both the legacy media and the social media that is circulating a particular framing of this conflict, which is really disturbing. And that is that this conflict is somehow different from so many of the ones that we've witnessed, not only over the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, but recent conflicts. When we think of the reportage, how it differs from Syria, for example. And here we have that quite obnoxious, despicable habit of the Western media to other people who are not like us in terms of the lifestyle we lead, the way that we look, and also our standard of living. So what we have, and I have got some notes here so that I don't misspeak, CBS News senior correspondent commenting that the Ukraine isn't a place with a history of Afghanistan that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European place. A French journalist commented, we're not talking here about Syrians fleeing a Syrian regime backed by Putin. We're talking about Europeans leaving in cars that look like ours to save their lives. So apparently, if their cars look like ours, they deserve attention. And finally, an ITV journalist commenting, looking at them, the way they address, they are prosperous. And I'm loath to use the expression, but I will, middle-class people. They are not looking to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. They are not people trying to get away from areas that don't look like where we live. And in the Telegraph in the UK, they seem so much like us, and that's what makes it shocking. And here, the media consumption of the Ukrainians is even compared. Ukraine is a European country. They watch Netflix and they have Instagram accounts. So again, this entitles you to, if you like, an elevated media profile. This is Europe, has been a common refrain. So this exceptionalizing of the minority world, again, is nothing new. We're used to the mainstream media othering countries where disasters happen. We see it every day, but that doesn't mean that we should not critique it as we are tonight. So my final comment is, what does the reporting that's going on, including the video capture 24/7 by civilians on their phones, what does it contribute to the topic we're discussing tonight? How can the media play a role, not just in sensationalizing or framing the lives of people in this conflict and categorizing them? What can it actually offer us in terms of, if not evidence, at least a window into what is happening on the ground? At the moment, I would say the journalism that we're seeing is a very flimsy basis for any sort of prosecution. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Tim and Matt have to say about the topic. So thank you.
And just a quick reminder to the online viewers, if you have questions, do pop them in the Q&A because they're being monitored by our team here. We'll address them later in the session. So Dr. Matt Killingsworth is Senior Lecturer in International Relations and Course Coordinator for the Bachelor of Justice Studies. He's currently researching the history of laws of war and new forms of international criminal justice. His past research has focused on opposition and dissent in communist Eastern Europe and justice in post-communist Eastern Europe and the changing nature of war. In 2013, he was a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford's Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict, and the 2014 recipient of a United States Department of State study of the U.S. Institute Scholars Grant. He's the chair of the Tasmanian Red Cross International Humanitarian Law Committee, and you may have heard him as a regular contributor on local and national radio. So thanks very much, Matt.
Generous introduction. A slight correction to my CV. I'm no longer the chair, so I don't want to upset the current chair of the IHL committee. She might be listening, so I've got to be careful on that one. Thank you, Alana. And what I want to do in my presentation is do two things. I want to expand a little bit on the propaganda that Alana spoke about and the rationale for the invasion of Ukraine, especially from the Russian side. And then to sort of lead into Tim's presentation on investigating war crimes, talk about some of the possible endings or conclusions to the current conflict and what they might look like, and in turn, what that might mean for, and again, sort of loop that back in around to ideas of propaganda. So I've identified 5 rationales that the Russians and Putin in particular have aired publicly as the justification for the invasion of Ukraine. And the first was in an essay that Putin wrote and was widely circulated in both obviously Russian and English, titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, where Putin stated that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, divided artificially by borders and outsiders. So we've already got that beginning of sort of propaganda of its outside influences who are stopping these sort of groupings together of one people. So this is the first justification. Second justification, and I'll make the point that a lot of these justifications are counter, they don't square with each other. Second justification is the one that I'm fascinated with. Ukraine never had a tradition of genuine statehood, and the nation now known as Ukraine was carved out of Russia by Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin. This idea that Ukraine is not an independent nation state, it should not be afforded protections. And it is a justification for Russia to invade Ukraine, to bring it back into the Russian fold, where it's always historically belonged. That Russia could not feel safe, develop and exist because of what Putin claimed was a constant threat from modern Ukraine. This was from Ukraine's desire to join NATO and the EU. Now, some of you might also be aware of the problems with this statement, that in trying to stop Ukraine joining NATO, they've instead encouraged Finland and Sweden to join NATO, and Finland, who also shares a 2,000-kilometre border with Russia. So this has also sort of been counterproductive in lots of ways. Alana's already mentioned the demilitarization and the denazification of Ukraine. I think this is a really fascinating sort of propaganda tool. And another sort of use of language that I'm fascinated with is that the Russians invaded because Ukraine was conducting a genocide of Russian speakers in Eastern Donbass. So this idea and this sort of appropriation of Western legal language, almost this responsibility to protect, that there was a justification to protect Russian speakers. The sixth justification, though, is this idea, again, that is deeply sort of the language of propaganda that Alana spoke of, and indeed, I think affects or sort of impacts and informs what Tim's going to talk about a little bit later, which is this idea of Ruski Mir, or the Russian world. And so this is the idea that Putin believes an invasion of Ukraine is a righteous cause and necessary for the dignity of Russian civilization. So sort of you can unpack that a little bit and think about sort of, again, the heavily loaded semantics in that. Russia's unique civilizational identity as a global bastion of traditional values and national conservatism needs to be protected. The Kremlin has a duty and a right to defend the interests and culture of Russian speakers all over the world. And this is a rejection of this Westphalian state system for an irredentist vision of an expansionist Russian civilization. So again, all of this sort of folds into what Alana was talking about the use of language and propaganda on this war, and then in turn what that means for the possibilities of justice or the possibilities of investigating war crimes after. I've identified 3 possible conclusions to the end of this war, and they all have sort of other permutations within them as well. The first is a Ukraine win, and I'll sort of use inverted commas a bit because I don't know what that looks like. A Ukraine win, I guess, is the expulsion of Russian troops from from Lugansk and Donetsk, and maybe a return to 2004 borders, so probably getting Crimea back as well. But that depends heavily on continued Western support, and in particular, the provision of weapons by NATO. I think there are questions about how long the West is going to stay interested in this conflict, the longer that it goes on. The second possibility is a Russian win, but again, I don't know what that looks like. I sense it looks like the annexation of Donetsk and Lugansk, and perhaps that sort of corridor down to Odessa, so that the Russians get a warm sea port, which is what they want with regards to Odessa. But again, this also has what victory in the end of the war looks like. It has really important sort of questions for what Tim's going to talk about and the capacity to investigate war crimes. The third one is the one that I think we're entering in at the moment, and it's the least palatable. This is the development of a so-called frozen conflict, where we have no great movements by either side, where we have maybe Russian advances and then counter-offenses by Ukraine, but essentially the determination or the claiming of land looks much the same. But what we have is heavy artillery bombardment and more loss, and especially damaging to non-military objectives and to civilian lives. I sense this is where we're getting at the moment with the way that the conflict is sort of getting bogged down. So that's some background that I hope is sort of valuable, and some ideas, I think, on what the war, how it might play out, that I hope is sort of giving some context to the propaganda that Alana spoke about. And I hope it gives some sort of context for what Tim is about to talk about as well. Thank you.
All right. Well, Tim McCormick has a world-renowned expertise in international humanitarian law and international criminal law. Among his extensive list of achievements, he's served as expert law of war advisor to the defense team for David Hicks for the trial by U.S. military commission in Guantanamo Bay. He's been amicus curiae on the international law matters for the trial of Slobodan Milosevic at the UN International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia in The Hague. He was a member of the Australian government delegation at the diplomatic conference to negotiate the Rome Statute, and he served as special advisor on war crimes, the former prosecutors of the International Criminal Court, Mr. Ocampo and Mrs. Fatou Bensouda. So please welcome local Bernie boy, Professor Tim McCormick.
Always thrilled to be back in my hometown. So thanks very much for coming out to make it a worthwhile event to be at. And it's a pleasure and honour to be on the same panel as Alana and Matt. Thanks for the introduction. I wanted to just thank you too, Daryl, for in your acknowledgement of traditional owners, linking what you were saying about them to the subject matter tonight. We need to remember that while we're focusing on contemporary or recent events and atrocities, some things happened here, including particularly on the Northwest Coast, under the authority of the Van Diemen's Land Company to our Indigenous people in this part of Tassie. And when I think about my subject matter, law of war crimes developed, or at least in its early inception in the first half of the 19th century, this body of newly emerging international law was never intended to apply to wars with, and not my words, but the words of the period of time, uncivilized savages. This body of law was being developed to apply to war between civilized, again in inverted commas, peoples. And that's appalling. I'm not trying to suggest that if I was not a product of the first half of the 19th century, I wouldn't have the same cultural baggage and the same values. But that doesn't mean we can't call it out now for being reprehensible, and so I do. I'd like to perhaps just start with, I think we've probably possibly made an assumption about what we mean by war crimes, and maybe it's good to just take a couple of minutes to clarify what we mean by that. I've been accused several times walking my dog along Nutgrove Beach in the morning of being a complete tosser, because how dare I sit in judgment as an academic in an ivory tower on those men of valour of the SAS in relation to allegations against some of them in Afghanistan. How can you judge? So you've never been on military operations? No, I haven't. Never pretended that I have. How can you sit in judgment of them? I'm actually giving some advice to the Office of the Special Investigator in Canberra at the moment on that subject matter. The answer is because their own colleagues have said that what some of the things that happened have crossed the line of what is acceptable and unacceptable, what is lawful and what is criminal. And how can we as a society ignore those claims? These need to be investigated. So when we talk about war crimes, we're talking about a body of international law to which Australia and all the other states in sovereign nation states in the world are states parties. Geneva Conventions, their additional protocols, some other key treaties that set some limits to the way war is conducted. Those limits include prohibition on the execution of detainees, of prisoners of war, of others in detention. They also include prohibitions on the targeting of civilians or of the targeting of civilian buildings or civilian objects. They also include rules on the types of weapons that can be used in warfare. And I think one of the features of the Western reporting, the media reporting of the conflict in Ukraine, which has really surprised me, is just how framed it is in terms of international law. When you have Sky News ringing experts on the law of war to understand what we mean by war crimes in the Ukraine conflict, you know that they understand we have to talk about this. This is something that's a part of this conflict and needs to be reported. And I also agree with Alana's comments about that's correct. And we should, well, I certainly as an international lawyer think that's a positive thing. But that is also true in Yemen and in Syria, now in its 12th year of crisis, and in all the other armed conflicts that are going on in the world. And it's a shame we didn't see the same commitment to the law as a judge of behaviour in armed conflict like we are seeing in Western media reporting of Ukraine. So let me talk about the media and its influence on the investigation of war crimes. And here I want to talk about two different things. The first one, the media as a catalyst for political will to investigate war crimes. And then the media as a source of evidence in the conduct of a trial or the conduct of an investigation leading to charges being laid and then a trial happening. So on the first, the media reporting as a catalyst for political will to investigate. Let me give you three examples from the last 20 years. In 2003, there were some shocking things going on in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq at the hands of US military who were responsible for managing the prison and managing the prisoners in it. And the only reason that the US military investigated alleged war crimes and instituted criminal proceedings against 12 individuals involved in that prison was because hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs and video were slipped to CBS, not necessarily a paragon of veracity, but nevertheless, big news network in the US who released them publicly. And you'll all have images that come to your mind of sexual and physical abuse, of torture, of the use of dogs, of all sorts of shocking things that we saw as images coming out of that prison. 12 months between when it all started and when those images were released publicly in 2004, and then the investigations happened after that. Think about in 2012, footage of which we only saw on our media, legacy media, I've got to say, makes that term makes me feel like an extremely old fart. Legacy meeting, mate. They'll be saying that about you. You're legacy bloody lecturer or whatever, legacy academic. Way past it. But we saw on Four Corners in 2020 some footage taken from a helmet camera by a dog handler of an SAS trooper summarily executing an unarmed Afghani detainee in a field. Shocking footage, shocking. Wasn't dialogue, it was a monologue from the person committing the execution. And I'm not suggesting that this footage and the making of it publicly was the catalyst for the initiation of the investigation. The Brereton inquiry was almost completed. I think it actually raised up the ante, the pressure on the federal government to ensure that when the Brereton report was handed down with its recommendations, there was a serious process put in place to systematically and rigorously investigate the allegations of war crimes perpetrated by our war heroes, the Special Air Services. Not all of them, I don't mean that, by some of them. Third example is in Palestine, in occupied Hebron. In 2016, a Palestinian guy was lying prostrate on the ground with having been wounded, unable to move. He was not an innocent. He had just stabbed an Israeli soldier, but he'd been controlled. He was lying on the ground. And a young Israeli Defence Force soldier by the name of Elor Azaria, the guy on the ground's name was Abdul Fattah al-Sharif. Let's give them names. They were human beings, both of them. Elor Azaria, from 2 meters away, shot that guy point blank through the head and killed him. That was captured on social media. Heaps of people in the crowd watching what was happening had the footage of that, and it was uploaded onto the internet immediately. And the footage, which went viral globally, put pressure on the Israeli authorities. Elor Azaria was originally charged with murder. Then the political machinations, the Israeli government got involved, including Benjamin Netanyahu, and the charges were downgraded to manslaughter. Elor Azaria in the end was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. Now, these 3 examples for me, I mean, there are plenty of others, could have given you heaps of them. All 3 involved incredibly graphic images. All 3 of them, I think, had a role to play in influencing what I'm describing as a political commitment, a political will to commit to an investigation. The political machines react differently in different circumstances. That's one of the challenges, I think, for lawyers who want to see the law applied in a principled, systematic, impartial way. We don't see that. We see inconsistencies, actually. But if it wasn't for the capturing of the imagery in each of those 3 cases and the making of it public, I wonder to myself whether the outcomes would have been the same. The first 2 were legacy media in a sense, capturing of images on smartphones in Abu Ghraib prison, but not to upload onto the internet. They were leaked. The person who leaked them, I don't know who that was, but they took a huge risk. But in Elor Azaria's case, it was absolutely social media that played this role of forcing the hand of the Israeli authorities to go through the process of an investigation, the laying of charges and a criminal trial, even though, in my view, the charges were sanitized for political consumption in Israel. Now, the reality is that in this last 20 years, we are now in a situation where the operation of military operations, the conduct of military operations of war is being captured in real time, or virtually, being captured while it's happening and uploaded to YouTube or whatever other platform almost instantaneously. I think about, just to sort of play on the legacy theme for a minute. In 1968, a platoon of US infantry soldiers went into the Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai. Those of you old enough like me to know about the My Lai massacre know what I'm talking about. 528 unarmed Vietnamese civilians were slaughtered. Now that story never got out until 18 months after the event, when Seymour Hersh, the investigative journalist with the New Yorker subsequently, but at the time, I think freelancing, reported it in a St. Louis daily newspaper in Missouri. And when that story broke, some photographic images were also uncovered from soldiers who'd taken photographs knowing full well that what had happened was completely illegal, criminal, and an egregious atrocity. But this is the contrast, I think, between the 1960s or even the early 2000s and now. It took 18 months in that case, even in Abu Ghraib, 12 months before somebody slipped a CD-ROM with all these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs to a media outlet to make them public. Now in Syria, and certainly in Ukraine, we are seeing images every day, if we want to go looking for them, available and accessible through the internet. So the second of my two reflections is social media as a source of evidence, what's happening in terms of the conduct of investigations and particularly of the conduct of trials. We have ubiquitous images, they're everywhere. Think about in the Ukraine situation, the harrowing images we saw of footage on mainstream media as well as social media, if you wanted to look for it, of charred bodies in the streets of Bucha, the northern suburb, outlying suburb of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. As Russian forces withdrew, they allegedly executed civilians and burned their bodies to try to destroy the evidence. That's the message that we were told. That doesn't automatically mean that images uploaded instantly onto the internet can be used in a war crimes trial. And this, I think, is one of the challenges about social media. Social media might alert us to the fact that some shocking things could have happened in Bucha. And as a consequence of that, Ukraine deployed its investigators, and so did the International Criminal Court deploy some of its investigators on the ground in Ukraine to go and find out what actually happened. The use of imagery like that is no substitute for the forensic investigative process of determining how many people were killed, when were they killed, by what means were they killed, how long between, if they were shot through the head, how long between when they were shot through the head and when their bodies were set on fire. Are we sure about the cause of death? All of those things that are absolutely fundamental information, fundamental evidence to be able to bring a charge against an individual accused and have them convicted of war crimes. There's no substitute for that. Doesn't matter how good the photographic imagery is. Of course, what gets loaded up in real time onto the internet always is accompanied by serious questions of proof. Who actually took this footage? Where were they and at what time on what day? And has this footage been edited? Either by the person who uploaded it or by somebody else who accessed it and changed it and put a different version up. Those things are always important issues of proof in any criminal trial process. I've just learnt about, in the last few days, a new app, relatively new app for the mobile phone called Eyewitness to Atrocities. I actually downloaded it because I wanted to check it out. This software has been prepared by the International Bar Association in conjunction with a few NGOs committed to global justice and to more effective holding of individuals accountable for their atrocities. And the idea is that once you download the software onto your phone, you enter into a contractual agreement with the managers of the software. And anything you upload is encrypted with date, GPS identification of the location, and date and time, of course, so that they can pinpoint exactly where that footage was taken and exactly when it was taken. And that really helps overcome some of the vagary, some of the variables in questions of proof of what is this, who took it, and where were they when they took it? Has it been edited? The encryption of the data makes it impossible to edit. And apparently this software has already been used in international criminal court proceedings in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And according to the story that I was reading online, there are many people in Ukraine who've uploaded the software and are using it, which is an extremely, from my perspective, very encouraging thing. That there's strategic thinking out there about how do we optimize the capturing of imagery by eyewitnesses who may become critical sources of evidence in subsequent trial proceedings. Alana and Matt and I are all committed to speaking for no more than 10 minutes each. All of us could have spoken for 45. We're very used to that sort of time frame.
2 minutes finished 10 minutes ago.
We should talk about what a war crime is. No, you're right, Matt. I said I'd do it in 10 minutes. She said, no, it'll be impossible for you. Never seen you do it in 10 minutes ever. But having gone over it substantially, I need to stop. I could talk a lot about why it is that the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction in Ukraine, but I won't do that. Is there any questions you want to ask about that? No worries at all. That'll give me free license. Matt will have his own views as well. So thank you very much.
So while the speakers are getting seated, for convenience, I just might read the first online question and we can go from there. It's a question from Matt. From Simon. Has Russia ever used legitimate institutions of international law to try and promote any of the rationales that they've advanced to justify their military action? If they haven't worked through legitimate institutions, could it be argued that they've repudiated their standing as a member of the UN Security Council? You can't have it both ways.
Russia's trying to have it both ways. They are so as a permanent member of the Security Council, and so Tim's going to talk more about this, but they've violated both as a crime of aggression, so the invasion of Iraq. So there's a Freudian slip. Yeah, the invasion of Ukraine in and of itself is both illegal and immoral. I had a great conversation with students today over at Don College where we spoke about both that over time, the use of force to get what you want has not only become illegal, but also increasingly immoral. You're not allowed to do it. I mean, this is naked imperialism. It went out of date at the end of the Second World War. And so this is where there's multiple shocks that both Tim and Alana spoke about with respect to the Ukraine war. One of them is that we're not used to seeing countries invade other countries because they've got something that they want. This is, again, we've evolved beyond that. And then there's the multitude of jus in bello crimes, so the crimes during the conflict that have happened in Ukraine as well. So my short answer to Simon is no, that in a better world or a more just world, there would be a way to ensure that Russia was A, not allowed to do what they're doing with respects to Ukraine, and B, that there was a clearer pathway to finding justice for those crimes as well. But the impediment is their permanent membership of the UN Security Council, their lack of signatory to their own statute, and it undermines the whole UN system, the way that it was designed about sort of collective responsibility. And we spoke about Syria. It goes to Syria as well, and the protection of Syria by the UN Security Council. So yeah, it's dark days in lots of ways for the UN, but darker days for the way that Russia behaves as well.
Can we have one from the audience now? We'll try and alternate best we can. Yes.
It's probably for Alana more than the other guys. But do you think that social media desensitizes us from, I suppose, not being aware of what's happening, but almost caring what's happening, in the sense that, like, I can scroll TikTok, for example, and I can see people in Ukraine capturing their day to day, so to speak, and therefore I go, oh well, it's not that bad, because you've got a phone, you're capturing your day, like you're uploading to socials, so therefore, like, you know, surely everything's okay because you can upload to TikTok. And I remember once reading, just as a side note, an article about, there was a photo, and I think it was some type of asylum seekers, and they had mobile phones. And I remember the article actually stated they have mobile phones, like why is it such a big deal that they're trying to get, like, it's almost like having a mobile phone means that you don't have any issues in the world. Like, because if you can upload to socials, if you have a device that you can connect to the rest of the world, then therefore why is anything an issue for you, or why are you going through this, I suppose.
The audience, online audience should hear, but I'll just paraphrase. I'll try to paraphrase each question. So
They
that
should hear, Daryl.
they should hear. The microphone should be picking you up. But the question was effectively, is there a risk that we can become desensitized or fatigued from seeing these things 24/7? And or comparatively, could we become desensitized from the fact that people actually appear to have regular lives for some of the time? Yeah.
That's a really excellent question. And I've got a couple of points to well, no, it is actually really important, because I had the same sense of cognitive dissonance watching exactly what you're talking about, seeing people going to work, having trouble getting to work in the Ukraine. And I felt like it was the first time I had realised, and of course it's true, when there's a war going on, people still have lives, daily lives. So that in itself is actually potentially really good for us to know. Again, it's relatable because they're doing jobs like we are, or going to work in a city that looks like ours possibly. So there is that. And I do agree that there is a certain a desensitization, we might call it, but it's a different sort of desensitization from what we traditionally call, and again, the legacy media have, I guess, inflicted this on us for a long time. But we've talked about compassion fatigue forever, which is why some people don't put on the 6 p.m. or the 6:30 or the 7 p.m. news, depending on what news you watch, because they just can't take any more horror. So compassion fatigue is not new, but as you say, it's a different type of, a different blend of news, different blend of images. And on the question about people having access to technology and therefore they must be okay, that again we know is a total misnomer. Well, most of my work's in food security, and the Indian farmer has a mobile phone. He or she leapfrogged the personal computer, but it doesn't mean that they're doing well. So, yeah, thank you for the question, though.
Thanks. I'm going to try and batch two questions from online to Tim. So Kat asked, Tim, you've talked about how imagery on social media has revealed evidence that led to trials in IHL. However, has social media led to any changes in IHL itself, International Humanitarian Law itself, or do you anticipate it doing so? And a question to piggyback on that, what effect does social media have on substantive issues of law?
It's a really good question. Perhaps just for clarification for the audience in person as well as the online audience, IHL is the acronym for International Humanitarian Law, which we use synonymously with the law of war or the law of armed conflict. So using all those terms to mean the same thing, the body of international law rules that apply in the context of an armed conflict, distinct from the body of rules about when it's permissible and when it's not permissible for a sovereign nation state to resort to military force. Matt was talking about the invasion of Ukraine constituting the crime of aggression, correct? Once the war started, the international humanitarian law applies to both the Russians and the Belarusians on the Russian side, and the Chechens and anyone else, and also to the Ukrainians and everyone involved on the Ukrainian side. My intuitive reaction is no. I don't think the use of social media has ever led to a substantive change in the law. And what we're talking about is a capturing of compliance with or violations of that body of law. But that's a possibly overly simplistic answer, because to the extent that the ubiquity of social media is an indication of how digitally connected we all are, there's no question that international humanitarian law must adapt to cyber warfare, for warfare conducted digitally, virtually. the rules as the legacy rules of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s were designed for kinetic warfare, for physical warfare, for bombs that go bang and cause destruction. And back in 1949, when the 4 Geneva Conventions were negotiated, no one even had any conception of the possibility that parties to a conflict could wage war electronically to disrupt telecommunications, transport, civil aviation, banking, you name it, whatever. So I think it's important to make that sort of observation. There's a lot of work going on trying to figure out to what extent do the existing rules of international humanitarian law deal with warfare, electronic warfare, which of course the Russians and the Ukrainians and a lot of Ukrainian allies are right into at the moment. There's no way a war is being conducted now that doesn't include both kinetic and electronic aspects to it. So there's a challenge, I think, for the international lawyers working with militaries around the world to identify those unique aspects of electronic warfare for which the existing body of rules is inadequate. And what do we need to agree to in terms of regulation to be able to cover some of those gaps, or some of the new modalities of warfare, or some of the new targets that perhaps aren't adequate?
So I've got a question about the collection of evidence. If you answering that question about the effect on substantive law, don't you think that the capacity to collect real-time evidence is an impact on the substantive law? In that there won't be the capacity for there to be so many holes in the proving of cases at the ICC. So that will mean that there will be an impact on the substantive law because there will be more provable crimes. You think about that footage, as you say, of the Afghani civilian being executed. That is affecting in a way that I think still images or other images are not.
Yeah.
Will there be more substantive law because there's more substantive evidence?
Thanks very much for the question, Alex. I guess I was maybe thinking too narrowly or formalistically about what I mean by substantive law. I'm thinking about the rules that apply rather than about the provability, the discharge of the onus of proof. So there's no question that the footage out of Afghanistan or some of the footage out of Ukraine will make the job of the prosecution, whether the prosecution in Ukraine at the national level, prosecutions at the International Criminal Court, an easier task in some cases because there's irrefutable video footage that's been captured and that's authenticated and provable. So I accept that. And I mean, it's more broad-reaching than just these examples that we're talking about. Satellite imagery is being used extensively now in the proving of mass crimes because you can demonstrate the before and after images captured in space, before, just hours before, and afterwards, hours after, well, for example, the shelling has ceased, and see the devastation that's just been wreaked on this particular targeted, whatever it is, whether it's a residential tower of apartments or whether it's a whole city block or whether it's an entire village. So there's a lot happening that's making the job of international investigators easier than it might have been in the absence of that sort of evidentiary material.
So really quickly and further that comment, I'd be fascinated to track the correlation between the advent of social media and the degree to which the language of war is increasingly used around those atrocities. So the idea, we're hearing language of genocide in Ukraine, we hear, so I think there's a degree to which the law language of war has permeated conflict with, and there's a degree to, I think, that it's correlated with the rise of social media. But again, that's just something that think might have happened. There's maybe a PhD in that for someone in the room.
Thanks. I'm going to put together two questions from online. Susan asks, can someone, and I'm going to point to Matt on this, can someone please explain the current status of Nazism in the Ukraine?
Yeah.
Is there any basis for Putin's claim? And an anonymous question, given how the propaganda is focused to support the Ukraine, that's to say how Western propaganda or public sentiment in the West is focused to support the Ukraine, are Ukrainian war crimes getting ignored?
So the first one, you have spoke in your introduction about, and as did Alana, about the deep historical significance of this war. That this war doesn't start from 1991. It doesn't start from Holodomor. It doesn't start from Ukraine independence. The Nazification claim has credibility because during the Second World War, Ukrainians did join the German forces to fight. But they were fighting the communists because the communists in the Soviets had screwed them over so badly in the 1930s. So this is why this claim of Nazification or Ukrainians as Nazis has traction, because of that sort of picking sides and trying to settle scores. And they're not the first groups to try and settle scores during conflicts by joining up with people who they wouldn't normally join up with. So this is why this claim has resonance. Of course, there is a far-right movement in Ukraine, but it is of minimal consequence. It doesn't have any electoral success. It sits on the fringes. But the historical significance is this is why that claim of denazification has such resonance in Russia. And this gets back, so we haven't spoken about this as much as we should, but the messaging around this war has different audiences. The messages, so for Putin talking about denazification, that's for an internal Russian audience. When he uses the language of international law, that's for a broader audience. And so there's multiple audiences that are there for the language that is being used. So it has resonance because of historical value, because of historical circumstances, but there's no credibility to it in sort of contemporary times. And what was the second one?
Are Ukrainian war crimes being overlooked because the Western media propaganda is all in favour of Ukraine and all opposed to Russia? It's very important, I think, that the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has stated explicitly that in the opening of a formal criminal investigation, he is looking at allegations on all sides of the parties to the conflict. That's a very important statement and it needs to be followed through. I think with the Ukrainian national war crimes, already 4 Russian soldiers have been convicted of war crimes. It's very important to the credibility of those trials that the Ukrainian prosecutorial authorities that are laying charges and conducting those trials are also investigating allegations of Ukrainian war crimes. And there are allegations of detainee abuse and the mistreatment of Russian prisoners of war. And they need those allegations need to be investigated. Maybe that there won't be trials in relation to the allegations. It might be that there's insufficient proof or the allegations are proved to be spurious, but it's very important that the investigations occur. Otherwise, it's all one-sided and impartial, and that's not good enough.
I was just wondering if any of the panel have any thoughts about the benefits that people in Ukrainians, Afghanis get from being able to be heard, to have what they've witnessed be investigated.
I might put that to Alana. So benefits of being heard as people living in war.
Yes, thank you. I think that when it comes to sources, it's a real dilemma for journalists covering the Ukraine, of course, because our aim when we report on something is to offer balance. Now, objectivity is a highly suspect term. I think most people would agree that even the most thorough reporter is going to have to include some things and leave out others. I think that when you have the absence of I want to say rational, but I shouldn't, but when you have the absence of a genuine or authentic source from the point of view of Russia,
then you do have opportunity to seek other perspectives. So I think that people on the ground, again, largely because of digital technologies, the affordances of the mobile phone, for example, mean that we can get those direct reports from people. But again, I think it's much more than a language barrier, because again, we haven't heard from as many sources on the ground in Syria. And I do think that, again, we see this privileging, this foregrounding of particular voices and these stereotypical images of the family, of the mother who's lost her child, of the first responders. And I again think it's impossible, perhaps as a reporter on the ground, to provide any balance in this sort of conflict. I have utter admiration for the war correspondent, but again, they're usually choosing a side, and it's really difficult not to choose a side.
Maybe I'll throw another question in and I'll follow up on that. Back to you, Alana, and then Tim. There's a question from online from Nick. Would members of the panel care to comment on the role of organizations such as Bellingcat? We'll explain to you what that is if you don't know, which go beyond provision of evidence to forming opinions on responsibility for criminal activity. Bellingcat, forensic architecture, there's a number of, I guess we could call them NGOs like that, who gather open source online information and try to do forensic reconstruction of war crimes. So maybe I'll start with you, Alana, and we can skip to Tim.
So just in response to the earlier question and following up Alana's comments about media reporting as a means of being heard. I think about the criminal trial process as a means of being heard, and of communities feeling as though what's been perpetrated against them has been taken seriously and people have been held accountable. There's some very interesting empirical study out of the Balkans, former Yugoslavia, where comparing and contrasting communities whose atrocities were tried and for which individuals were criminally accountable, compared to those where the atrocities were not the subject of criminal trial. And the results of the empirical studies are that there is a discernible difference in the ability of a community to rebuild and move on where accountability has actually happened. Now, I think that sometimes we're placing too much expectation on a criminal trial process to produce that sort of result at the community level, because the trial process is about whether the prosecution can adduce sufficient evidence to discharge the onus of proof beyond reasonable doubt that this individual is criminally responsible for these crimes. There's a whole lot of selection in that, a whole lot of selection in which particular incidents of crime are we going to prosecute, because we've got the witnesses that can tell us what they saw or what they experienced, what their family members experienced. So there's that selectivity inevitable in the criminal trial process means that some things are excluded, some people's stories are excluded, some people aren't asked to give evidence because their evidence relates to a different incident. But I'm nevertheless fascinated by these studies, and I've spoken with some investigators, criminal investigators at the Yugoslav Tribunal who were involved in undertaking them, going out and interviewing community members. And the fact that they are able with such assurance and certainty to say there is unquestionably a beneficial effect suggests to me that the accountability is fundamental to a society that's experienced egregious atrocity.
So the question was, I guess, what is your opinion or what is your take on NGOs or like Bellingcat or others that use open source information to construct, not only reconstruct war crime scenes, but then render online judgments about those scenes?
Well, I'd say that NGOs would be enormously important in terms of capacity building, the potential to gather information on the ground, whether they have a remit to make decisions and make judgments is highly questionable. So I think, knowing, my own experience with grassroots NGOs, they're incredibly important because they're often embedded as well, and they're able to talk to people, reach people, and offer a very nuanced perspective on what's happening, and also reach people, and they're often trusted. So I think that they're incredibly important. But again, many have an agenda, and if they're not partisan, I think it's really problematic.
Thanks, Alana. I agree. I think there's a crowded space in the rush to be part of making a substantive contribution to accountability. And there are lots of NGOs as well as intergovernmental organisations and nation states deploying incredible personnel and financial resources into helping investigate war crimes, crimes against humanity in Ukraine. I mean, I've never seen an effort like this. And that includes the NGOs like Bellingcat and many other organisations that want to be part of trying to preserve evidence, trying to identify witnesses, many of whom might have fled Ukraine and they're outside the country and therefore safer to be able to, to talk through what they've experienced. The idea of passing judgment through reconstruction of open online source material is no substitute for the criminal trial process. I think what it could do is alert investigators to, you really should be looking at this individual person's criminal responsibility, trying to piece together who is most responsible for this pattern of conduct, the strategy allegedly of sniping fleeing civilians after declaring a humanitarian safe corridor for civilians to flee a particular city under siege. Who in the Russian hierarchy, military hierarchy, is most responsible for a strategy like that? If a Bellingcat judgment points to individual criminal responsibility, it may help focus the attention of investigators at the ICC or in Ukraine or collaboratively together. But it's not going to mean that individual will be held criminally responsible because an NGO has made a judgment online about that.
We're starting to come to the end of our evening, and there's just a flood of online questions, so I'm obviously not going to be able to get to them all. I see one audience question here.
Yeah, I'm curious with the investigation of war crimes. The individual, we spoke about the in Palestine, the guy shot the guy who was defenseless. Obviously, the guy that pulled the trigger has something to answer for. But is there a wider organization that has something to answer for? And how do you affect a prosecution, a successful prosecution against that? And I think that's maybe where you were leading when you were last explaining something. Because the guy at the bottom end of the food chain, if you like, will always be the guy who fundamentally pulls the trigger. But what are the reasons behind him not being forced to pull the trigger? Because that's a decision that he makes individually. But how do we successfully prosecute the people that fundamentally give the orders?
How do you prosecute a structure that sets up the prerequisites for atrocities?
Excellent question. Thanks very much for asking it. I'd agree with you that individual soldier has a choice to make, chose a particular choice and was punished for it. You can argue whatever you like about how lenient or how severe that sentence was, but he was held criminally responsible. But I have to say that, and this is not because I'm a father of adult children, as a human being, I'm grateful that I am not part of the occupation of the West Bank of Palestine, and that I or anyone I love dearly was subjected to 3 years compulsory military service in that context. When a country occupies another people for now, 1967, nearly 70 years, nearly 60 years, already 60 years. No, 60 years in 2027. Your maths is
She's
appalling.
not a maths major.
Clearly not a maths major. And my maths teacher can't believe I'm an international lawyer. My maths teacher in grade 5, I met a few months ago, last year. Can't believe I'm an international lawyer. I thought you were going to do maths. No, mate, no. Okay, so 60 years in 2027. The society, in my view, becomes corrupted by that. The moral fabric of the society becomes corrupted. And yes, I agree with that general thrust of the question, not only in the specific context of Palestine or the occupation of Palestine, but also in relation to the SAS in Afghanistan. These elite special forces were deployed 12 times and into a context where apparently their mission was not clear. You work it out, for yourselves. Really? So where is the criminal responsibility for the decisions that led to the context in which individuals made choices to break the law? And I am really infuriated by the politicians who make the decision to send our military off to war and are never held accountable for the consequences that flow from that decision. Not even electorally, let alone criminally. For former Prime Minister Tony Abbott, I think he should have made a Prime Minister visit to Afghanistan. Please don't misunderstand me. Not suggesting he shouldn't have been there. But him to say, well, shit happens, I suppose, in war. I mean, really? Well, who made the decision to send them there? Unfortunately, in our system, the executive arm of government, probably meaning the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Defence Minister, maybe the Foreign Minister, a select group of cabinet in the context of the National Security Committee makes a decision that we will go to war. America asks us, we say yes. There's no parliamentary scrutiny of that decision. There's no accountability to the electorate for that decision. And our military go off, and they go off not once, not twice, but in the case of Afghanistan, over a 15-year period, with regiments of the elite special forces deploying more than 10 times. Now, there's a whole lot of levels of seniority, not just in the military, in my view, that should be called to account for the consequences of their decisions. Yeah, it's a tricky question.
More geopolitical questions for Matt. So, is there any reliable information on Putin's health? And and then there's from Margarita, another question for Matt. Considering that Russia and Putin have used the argument that Ukraine's a security threat, what impact will membership of Finland and Sweden in NATO have on Russia's perception of security?
So the Putin health one is really fascinating. There's a cottage industry in sort of looking at pictures and the shaking hand and perhaps a little bit of puffiness to sort of see is Vladimir sick. Pictures like this have been circulating for how long now? So there's 2, it's 8. This is his second lot of 8. It was Medvedev in the middle. So nearly 20 years. There have been pictures sort of circulating about, does this picture demonstrate that Vladimir Putin is about to die? No. So it's almost like sort of watching the North Korean dictator as well and trying to find scenes. So the closed nature of the Russian political system means that you could sort of give that sort of stuff pretty short shrift. But I do understand the fascination with watching, and Tim and I got this question the other day about what does the ongoing health and does removing Putin change the situation in Ukraine?
I think you should disclose grade 4 Riverside primary strategy. You should tell the audience about that. That's hilarious.
So we got told yesterday that the grade 4s at Riverside Primary are gathering together to try and find a way that they can perform a hit squad on Vladimir Putin in Russia. And sort of, so there's this grade 4 wet to the rescue. There's this grade 4 wet team that is going to go into Moscow. Yeah. Sort of like Spy Kids, but from Riverside Primary. So
this is probably something not encouraged by the teachers.
Indeed, well, this is obviously playground chatter for the grade 4. So yeah. So
just out of them.
So I think you've got to be wary of sort of reports of Putin and the pictures and that sort of thing. Again, I haven't written down the second question. I got taken away.
The impact of Finland and Sweden's membership in NATO?
There's not a direct impact on Russia, but it is, again, I think it's a misconception at the beginning of the war from Ukraine that the West was divided. And there was a perception that the EU was divided over primarily Brexit, issues of immigration. There was a perception as a result of former US President Trump saying that he was going to ignore Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, that an attack on European states wouldn't necessarily mean that the US would intervene, as they are obliged to under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. And so there was a perception, I think, that the West was divided and wouldn't come together around in their united condemnation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that was a real misreading, because I don't think the EU has been as united. There's a little bit of fraying. I was fascinated to read at the moment that it looks like that Spain and Portugal is looking like settling some old scores with Germany around the Euro crisis and gas supplies. So there's still tensions in Europe. But NATO, I mean, Finland, the idea of Finland joining NATO, who for so many years, with the threat of Russia on their border, has said, no, this would merely aggravate Russia, our joining. Sweden, who has shown neutrality with respects to military operations for so long. And so them joining with a little bit of sort of toing and froing from Turkey, which was some politicking from Erdogan as well. This, I think, has demonstrated a misreading of security situation by Putin. And I think that it will serve to reinforce those against Russia, and will sort of offer protections for them. But beyond that, nothing sort of really immediate. Yeah.
I just have to comment on Putin. Again, the Western media framing of Putin is very obvious. The puffiness is a thing, and the way we're seeing him isolated at large tables all the time. And I just want to compare that with Zelensky's amazing Zoom skills and his T-shirts. Everyone's trying to buy his T-shirts. So got the guns out and he looks fantastic. And this is, again, nothing new, because we have had charismatic leaders throughout history, dare I say, Hitler. But we've also got Subcomandante Marcos, who came out of the Mexican countryside, took over Chiapas. He was a poet and a hero, a folk hero. He was Shay. He was like Shay. So we've got, I think, Zelensky here again as this great fodder for memes, and not to mention the fact he used to be a stand-up comedian. So what's better than that? But Putin can't compete with that. But in Putin's world, he doesn't need to.
With bare chest on the back of a
Yeah,
horse.
he used to. He was always riding around bare-chested. But I guess as he's aged, he's given that up, probably.
Legacy activity.
Yeah. I think we've got time for only one more question. I'll take one from online or, okay, your question, please.
Matt gave 6 justifications for Putin's invasion. Are they the only things that he can be judged, or it sounds like he's giving, is that a good idea that he gave those reasons for the law court, or will they use those? Is that the only things he can be convicted on? He obviously can't be convicted directly on the atrocities. So
yeah.
Okay, yeah. So can Putin be convicted on the statements he made? I'll also throw in one from online just to wrap it up. From Lily, she talks about our discussion about boredom and disinterest in Syria. What can be done to reframe things like the ongoing war in Syria, and I suppose here in Ukraine, to bring it back or to keep it in the Western media? So we'll wrap up on those 2 questions. First to you.
No, to Matt. I think you want to go? Matt was the one who gave the justification.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think Matt was asking Matt.
The only ones that I can think that he might be able to be convicted of if he had a stated genocidal intent, which he hadn't done. So not conviction on those claims, but the claims nonetheless are important, again, because the 6 of them appeal to different people. And not that there's a legal basis to them, but there is an attempt to frame this war as having a legitimacy to it, by using that language. And by using that language by dehumanizing and delegitimating Ukraine, which for Russia then means they are not afforded those protections that Tim has been talking about. Now, of course, they still are. But as a tool of justifying the war to Russians, this is a really valuable weapon. But for as this respects to prosecuting them on those words, probably not so much.
I might just say something about Vladimir Putin and on trial as well, because Dale's interested in that question. So the fact that Putin hasn't personally perpetrated any of the atrocities, doesn't mean he couldn't be criminally liable for it. Because we have this concept in international criminal law of someone at a high level of authority ordering the perpetration of crimes or failing to exercise their authority to stop those crimes occurring, either way, making them also criminally liable. A number of the major war crimes trials in history, Nuremberg and Tokyo after World War II, and major trials since then, Slobodan Milosevic, General Mladic, Radovan Karadzic, charges against Omar al-Bashir, former president of Sudan, by the International Criminal Court. None of these trials, charges against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya before he was executed. None of these trials would ever include allegations that the individual accused perpetrated the atrocities themselves. But in their positions of seniority, they either ordered them or they failed to exercise their authority and effective control over subordinate forces to stop them. And either of those things makes them criminally responsible. So, I mean, the ICC, the International Criminal Court, not the International Cricket Council, International Criminal Court, if it ever laid charges against Vladimir Putin and if it ever had him in custody in The Hague, that doesn't look likely right now. But if that was to ever happen, the charges against him would be in relation to his exercise of authority over what Russian forces did rather than the perpetration of the atrocities themselves.
Thank you for the Syria question. I think it is so important, and I think that it does need reframing. I think we need to have publicly this conversation, and some journalists are having this conversation, bringing it forward, that there is a certain layering to this and a reason for this Western framing that goes beyond the fact that this is Europe. This is white middle class people, not all middle class, of course. There is also underneath that this underlying reliance on Russian energy, and of course the fact that 40% of the world's grain comes from this part of the world. So we need to think about these underlying drivers, and I think they're almost more vile than the "they look like us" argument, that there is a lot of vested interest in this. And it goes back to something that I think Matt mentioned, which is it takes the political will. It really requires people to own this, governments to own this, and for us to make noise about it. So, and that's where the media has a critical responsibility, and the media often disappoints me as a media scholar, and I think I can speak for most people in this room. So yes, a reframing of the argument about Syria, and otherwise we could get those year fours to do a media blitz or a crowdsourcing campaign. I'd donate.
Thanks, Alana. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, so I'm sure you'd like to join me again in thanking our wonderful panelists, Professor Alana Mann and Professor Tim McCormick and Dr. Matt Killingsworth. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the behind-the-scenes staff who've made the event possible this evening. Here on the Cradle Close, Clarissa Foster, Trudy Brown, Brandon Woolley, the team here from this campus, and the amazing Islands of Ideas team led by Sarah Goldstone. Thank you all very much. So this evening's talk will soon be available on a video recording and on podcast via the Island of Ideas website, which should be on screen. And you can find all the latest information about the upcoming events like this via that same webpage. So thank you all for taking part in this special and important event. And on behalf of the University of Tasmania and my fellow presenters here this evening, I'd like to wish you a good evening. Thank you and good night.